Hello, everyone. If you are just joining us, welcome to the RadicalxChange annual conference. Our next session will be Caring as an Act of Resistance. I'd like to welcome Marc to the stage to begin our session.
Hello, welcome to Caring as an Act of Resistance. So today we're kind of fortunate to have Cassie Thornton, Tomislav Medak and Elsa James on the panel. And each of them are going to have 10 minutes to do a presentation. And then there's going to be a few questions at the end from me. And then I'm going to offer anyone who's in the audience to ask some questions. So it's going to be tight, but interesting. So the main question is, what does care look like when it evolves out of a consciously critical lens and through a cultural practice? What knowledges and strategies do we need to acknowledge and build on in order to navigate through a world fractured by racism, class division, the COVID-19 virus, imposed austerity, international debt, as global communications infrastructures illegally and systemically hack and overwhelm democracy, fake news generating tiny groups of clandestine media, strategists work in alliance with dodgy politicians, corrupt financiers, and right-wing media giants. On top of this, we're also dealing with the mass extinction of wildlife and destruction of life-supporting ecosystems. What a mess we're in. Of course, it's not perhaps honest or realistic to answer these seemingly absolute issues here and now. However, continuing to pursue with acts which open up explorative and imaginative actions that negotiate for acceptance of our imperfections and thus building on new and old lived choices rather than conforming to the same hierarchies, behaviours and infrastructures which have caused the problems in the first place will help. Early 21st century needs better visions and more intuitive approaches for us to understand each other, technology, creatures and other things. The so-called strongmen have been the only ones with power to take decisive action, and they have failed us. Now is the time to bring other voices in from the ground. So I'll introduce you to our panel, who've all been exploring care as an act of resistance in their own context and terms. And so each, as I say, guest will have 10 minutes. So I'm going to introduce each bio first of all, and then go straight to the artist. So Cassie Thornton is an artist and activist from the US, currently living in Canada. Since before 2008 financial collapse, Thornton has focused on researching and revealing the complex nature of debt through socially engaged art. She is the artist in Pandemic at Furtherfield in London, working on social care for cooperative species, the hologram. She is currently the co-director of Reimagining Value Action Lab in Thunder Bay, an art and social centre at Lakehead University in Ontario, Canada. Elsa James is an artist and activist living in Essex, UK since 1999. Her work intervenes in the overlapping discourses of race, gender, diaspora, and belonging. Her Black British identity ignites her interdisciplinary and research-based practice located within the fields of contemporary performance, text, and language-based art, social, political, and socially engaged art, occasionally dabbling with drawing and painting. I'll let her talk about some of the context of that. And Tomislav Medak is a PhD researcher at Coventry University Centre for Post-Digital Cultures. He's also a part of the theory and publishing team of Multimedia Institute, MAMA, and an amateur librarian for the Memory of the World and Pirate Care initiatives, which I've enjoyed both of those, and a member of the performing arts collective Bad Co. His research interests are in technology, capitalist development and post-capitalist transition, with a particular focus on planetary ecological crisis, technoscience, and intellectual property. So I'd like to start first by inviting Cassie Thornton to discuss her work, please.
Hey, thank you. It's a huge honor to be here with Elsa and Marc and Tom. Such important work. I'm going to share my screen. So I'm presenting today a project that I've been working on since about 2016. It's called The Hologram, and it's a peer-to-peer mutual aid project that takes into consideration that we are a cooperative species, but we just have to remember how. And so it's a practice that is meant to create networks of support, which would create health, which would help us live through and beyond the end of capitalism. It's very much rooted in the idea that capitalism is the reason why one of the many reasons, but a very basic reason why we are experiencing such a crisis of care all over the world. And it's meant to build networks of support and solidarity that would outlast the end so that we can both demolish capitalism and create new, something new, whatever we need, a society that's centered around health and life. I live in right off of Lake Superior. This is where the couch is right now. I live in Canada. These people in this image are a member of a Indigenous street patrol that I'm a part of called Window Debwe Mosewin, where I've learned a lot of the things that go into this project. So I'm gonna start a little bit with the history of this project, which comes very much out of crisis, and it's a project made to help us through crisis. So during the Greek financial crisis, which was also a crisis, an immigration crisis, there were up to 60 free clinics that were developed all over Greece, where doctors and nurses and all different sorts of professional healthcare workers provided completely free healthcare, often in squatted buildings, many of them run by anarchists by assembly. And there was one particular group working in Thessaloniki called the Group for a Different Medicine, working at the Social Solidarity Clinic of Thessaloniki on a project called the Integrative Care Model. And the Integrative Care Model in some ways it's quite basic, but it's meant to ruin the hierarchies that are implicit in private and biomedical care in general. So I'm just going to explain a little bit about this one project, which was within a very multifaceted series of experiments that they were working on. And this project, as I said, it's called the Integrative Care Model. And when a person would go to the doctor, to the clinic in Thessaloniki, they would be seen by a therapist, a social worker, and a doctor. And the social worker was not a professional. They were a volunteer. And those three caretakers would sit with the patient for about 90 minutes and ask them all kinds of questions. So what do you eat and where do you work? Who is your family? To whom do you owe debts? And then they would come back together with the person after that time and try to come up with a plan where the person leads, the patient leads, and that they could design what they needed over the next year to make them healthy in terms of the whole picture of health. And a really important part of this project in dismantling hierarchies is not referring to the person coming in for help as a patient, but empowering them, seeing them as an incomer, because in Greek, patient infers the idea of being unhealthy or unwell. But this project is very much about how all people need care. And so the patient is called the incomer. Froso Morelli has become a person who Froso works on this project in Thessaloniki and has since the beginning, and has taught me a lot about this project, which has really impacted the hologram. And she said that after having been a psychologist professionally for a very long career, that finally, when she could be a psychologist in this situation, she could see the whole person. She felt that she could see all dimensions of a person and solve problems in such a more complex and rich way. And the person became, instead of a two-dimensional person, a hologram. And so that's where the name of the project comes. And I forgot to set my timer. So when I began this project, I was living in Oakland, California, realizing very clearly that while we were looking at Greece as being a place in crisis because of the financial crisis, but also because of the refugee crisis, we weren't acknowledging the crisis that we were living in the United States before Trump. Many people lived without any sort of access to medical care. So many people living on the street, and yet we weren't acknowledging that we were living in crisis. And so the project very much came out of the combination of the two situations. So how do we take the ingenuity that was produced in Greece when people came together to try to solve the crisis of health, and how can we apply that to an American context, which is now a context that I think applies to many more people in the world. And understanding that all of our crises are connected, that the hedge funds that were profiting off of Greece's bankruptcy were also the same hedge funds that were profiting off of the house flipping that was gentrifying and ruining Oakland, where I lived. I was really curious about how to kind of begin to learn about how all of our crises are connected and what kind of power that gives us. So our question is, how do you organize your own care before or during an emergency within a set of completely unstable conditions? And I would say that those conditions now are for all of us. So thinking of you, the viewer, where do you get care when you can't necessarily go to the doctor, when you can't necessarily afford to go to a therapist, when many of the systems that we've trusted in for many years are no longer the secure systems that we thought they were? So what we came up with was an idea of distributing labor and care, thinking about the person here that says expert as a person who is an expert about their own health, who then invites 3 friends to not to become advisors, but to become 3 people who ask really good questions about either the mental emotional health, the social health, or the physical health of this person. And so this person might call these friends together once, and then maybe they would make a plan and say, meet every season. And maybe they would start with doing that for a year, or maybe they would start with doing that for 4 years. But either way, the 3 friends that this expert invites become kind of like a living medical record for her. So we call this person the hologram, the person that is seeking out their own support. And they become something like a teacher who teaches these 3 friends or associates or family members, whoever they are, to ask really good questions about them, so that over time they can start to see all the complexity that makes this person healthy, and also what doesn't. One of the most important parts of the project is really seeing the person that's in need of care as a teacher, the person that has the capacity to articulate their needs and their vulnerabilities, and to organize the people that want to give them support. It's an incredible amount of work that's not valued by our society. And so a big part of this project is developing systems to support people to become holograms. So as I said, we're not replicating any sort of hierarchy or expertise in this project that is in the medical industry, although there is an implicit hierarchy in the project that's quite strategic. What we're doing is we're doing co-research. So when the hologram perhaps is suggested that they need a very expensive surgery, it's really useful to have 3 people that already know your history, who can help you figure out what questions to ask and how to figure out, like, do you really need that surgery? Is that surgery, where do you get that surgery? Who do you trust? All kinds of stuff like that. And the reason that they know about the history is because they ask really good questions over time and build up a kind of personal archive of what makes the hologram tick. And over time, as we know in all of our really good relationships, that when you know someone for a long time, you can see their patterns. It's not always so easy to intervene in those patterns, but I think one way that the hologram can work is that the 3 people supporting her can actually begin to see and then just say or nudge about the patterns that maybe are or are not working. And in the end, the point is that when so much is changing in our world, and so like people all over the world are losing their jobs, we've lost lots of loved ones because of the pandemic, so much is changing because of climate change, and obviously so much is changing on so many levels for so many people. No one should have to make really big decisions alone, especially when we all are making really big decisions and struggling. So this is a way of sort of distributing the work of support, so that we don't have to make decisions alone. And so this project is viral, and it's viral because we can't get care. We cannot accept care from someone who's not cared for. We already know better than that. So in this project, you, the viewer, you can imagine yourself as the hologram in this biggest circle. And the three hard lines would extend to three people who are looking after you, and those people are called your triangle. And each of those people have three people looking after them, causing the project to become viral.
Okay,
And,
Cassie.
yeah?
That's your 10 minutes.
Perfect.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to ask questions at the end, Cassie.
Yeah, perfect.
And everyone else. So it's Tomislav turn. Do you want to come and say hello and discuss your...
Hello, everyone. Delighted to be sharing the panel tonight with Cassie and Elsa. Cassie asked the question, how do you organize your own care before or during an emergency within a set of completely unstable conditions? And that's the exact question that we are pursuing with the project of Pirate Care. Pirate Care is a project that my colleagues, Valeria Graziano, Marcel Mars, and I myself have convened with the objective to map and connect collective practices that are emerging in response to the neoliberal crisis of care. Throughout our lives, we depend on the support of our families, friends, strangers, and institutions to sustain ourselves and to sustain the world in which we and the future generations have to live. That interdependency of humans and non-human nature in social and ecological reproduction defines the relations of care, and the effort to sustain those relations defines the labor of care. Yet over the last decades, against the background of financialized global capitalism, the convergence of processes that include rollout of workfare, rollback of reproductive rights, austerity measures, and criminalization of migration, that interdependency and that support has been denied to many. In response to that denial, making lives disposable, practices we have called pirate care are organizing to help migrants survive at sea and on land, provide pregnancy terminations where those are illegal, offer health support where institutions fail. Self-organized childcare where public provision does not extend to everyone, and liberate knowledge where access is denied. Crucially, they share a willingness to openly disobey laws and executive orders whenever these stand in the way of safety and solidarity. And they share a willingness to politicize that disobedience, to contest the status quo. That disobedience and that politicization is what defines them as pirate care. It needs to be noted that caring is not intrinsically nice. It always involves power relations and processes of discipline, exclusion, and harm. It is a necessary and skilled form of labor that is shouldered by workers, mostly unwaged women and migrants, who themselves receive the least amount of care while serving those who take care for granted. Simply, reciprocity and solidarity are not implied. So to address this asymmetry, practices of pirate care are experimenting with forms of self-organization, alternative approaches to social reproduction, and the commoning of tools. Our project specifically aims to activate collective learning processes from the situated knowledge of these practices. In this, we have been inspired by the phenomenon of #syllabi, that is, crowdsourced online syllabi created by social justice movements in response to situations of intense antagonism, such as Ferguson's syllabus and Gaming and Feminism syllabus created in 2014, Trump 101 and Trump syllabus 2.0 in 2015, or Standing Rock syllabus created in 2016. We have written about the phenomenon in our article Learning from Syllabus, which was published by the Institute for Network Cultures and in cooperation with Marc's organization, Furtherfield. There, we have promised to develop a radical pedagogy approach that would help social justice initiatives write online syllabi of their own, and to do so in a technological framework that will allow that the syllabi, as well as the collections of texts that accompany them, be collectively created, easily preserved, and maintained independent from large digital platforms. Unfortunately, I don't have time to explain the technological framework, but in Q&A, I may come back to this. As we ourselves are situated between the institutional and the activist terrain, we were interested in mobilizing institutional resources to support these initiatives so that they could connect and grow their capacity for collective action through a production of knowledge and radical pedagogy that is inherent to their work and their needs. As the first such syllabus, we have started building with practitioners, activists, scholars of pirate care, a pirate care syllabus. The first round of topics were written in November during a writing retreat organized in Rijeka by Drugo More and launched on March 8th for an exhibition in Vienna. The syllabus, as you can see on the screen, which is an expanding work in progress, currently includes topics of criminalization of solidarity, sea rescue and care, debt and housing struggles, psychosocial autonomy, community safety from racialized policing, transfeminist hacking, hormone toxicity and bodily sovereignty, gender equality in tech milieus, politicizing digital piracy, and commoning care work and childcare. The next topic we hope to include is the one written by Cassie. On March 14th, with the outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic in Europe, together with our colleague Maddalena Franito, we have transformed our work on the syllabus into a collective note-taking effort to document organizing of mutual aid, solidarity, and care in response to the crisis, to the pandemic crisis. This effort we have titled Flatten the Curve, Grow the Care. What are we learning from COVID-19? With the participation of a broader pirate care network, we have collected and created around 15 notes, instructions, and how-tos that are coming from and are used by mutual aid organizers in Italy, Croatia, the UK, and elsewhere. The notes include information on how to assist people in home isolation or how to organize solidarity kitchens, on reproductive rights in isolation and quarantine, home violence, childcare, on mutual aid models for the jobless, for instance, sex workers, as well as the write-ups on the implication of the pandemic on disability, environmentalism, and technology. They're available in English, Italian, German, and Spanish. The famous graph in the title represents two curves standing for higher or lower rates of contagion and an unprecedented healthcare capacity, represented as a straight line that the ideal pandemic curve should not breach. We wanted to highlight how the straight line is never a straight line nor single line. It actually depicts the decline of society's capacity for care under the relentless neoliberalization and criminalization. Also, much in what has been termed the biggest crisis of care in the century isn't so new. With the pandemic, the pre-existing care crisis, until recently visible only on one side of the class, gender, and race divide, suddenly detonated as a generalized social threat. The lockdowns have revealed the fundamental dependence of societies on essential services. The frontline workers in healthcare, elderly care, in cleaning and food supply chain, or in transport, whose work is mostly invisible, devalued, and precarious, had no choice but to continue to go to work to not lose employment and income. Largely composed of women, people of color, and migrants, they had to risk infection, and their communities were predictably some of the hardest hit by the disease. Now that the data for the countries of the global north are in, and these countries are rushing to go back to normal, it is clear that those who were in the front line in essential services, those who had no choice but to go back to work and who were hardest hit by the epidemic threat, have remained, and unless we build from the political opening of the current situation, will continue to remain on their side of the class, gender, and race divide. We know that back to normal would be disastrous, as the normal was the problem. But this becomes an even larger problem as the world is edging toward an environmental breakdown. Just consider one example. How is it possible that a mere week of disruption can cause critical shortages of food worldwide? That 15 million of those living from paycheck to paycheck in the US might need assistance from food banks? That in the global food system, where a third of produced food is wasted, UN is now warning that 265 million will be pushed to the brink of starvation. How is it possible that the most fundamental good for maintaining human lives, that is food, could be so scarce yet so wasted? Our food systems are brittle. They're brittle because all high throughput systems subsumed under the imperative of capitalist accumulation require just-in-time efficiency. While seemingly flexible, they have little redundancy and resilience to be adaptable to the exogenous disruptions such as this pandemic. Global food production has been streamlined to cut the cost of labor, technology, and land. In the aftermath of the present disruption, we are bound to see hyper-automation of farms and recasting of food sovereignty along the nationalist lines. But technology and nationalism will not do away with brittleness. To do away with brittleness, we will need food provision organized on the principles of localization, collective holdership, better wages and labor conditions, and internationalism. This is what we are learning, for instance, in our notes describing organizing of Solidarity Kitchen by activists of Cooperation Birmingham and unionizing work with migrant workers by Saisonieri in Austria. Going forward, our systems of provision must not only be protected and reclaimed, but also detoxified and redesigned along anti-oppressive principles. Our future, if we want to have one, will be defined by a myriad of ruthless struggles to repair our world at different scales. This is where I end.
Thank you very much, Tomislav. Very good. Everyone, keep submitting questions to the speakers. I'm receiving some in the corner of the screen right now. If we've got time, we'll have them all, but I don't think we will. So I think we're gonna go straight to Elsa now.
Okay. Hi, thank you for having me. It's great to be here on this platform with Cassie, Tom, and Marc. So I'm going to share my screen first of all, and I want to sort of begin my presentation and focus on this world that's fractured by racism. And these are the words from Kimberly Jones. She was recorded about a week and a half ago, and it's gone viral on YouTube. But I want to kind of linger with these words. These are the last words in her in the film. It's a short film. I think it's about 6 or 7 minutes. Please go and watch it if you haven't. As I say, it's on YouTube. It's called How Come Film. But these are the last words she says in the video, and they haven't left me since I watched the film. And I just want to kind of, I just want this to kind of hover around my presentation, as it were. So thinking about, what knowledges, strategies do we need to acknowledge and build on in order to navigate through a world that is fractured by racism. I'm going to talk from a point of view of racism in the UK and my kind of personal experience. And I think for me, it starts off with being able to change the screen, acknowledging the past. So the British historian David Olusoga said just recently, Britain can no longer ignore its deepest, darkest chapters. and that we must teach Black history. And I'm always really surprised at how many white people that I speak to, you know, that doesn't realise Britain's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade, and that they don't know this, and they don't know Britain's involvement. And I, Elsa James is my name, I carry the burden of my ancestors' slave masters through my name. And so, what do we need to know? You know, what do I say that people should acknowledge? White people in Britain, particularly, is the past, their past. And also, importantly, why I am here. My parents are from the Caribbean. They came as part of the Windrush generation. We were invited to live here in Britain after the Second World War. Britain's the mother country, to help rebuild the country. And so I grew up as one of the first generation Black British children going to school in Britain. And so, you know, again, this is why I'm here, because I was invited, my parents and the Windrush generation, Windrush being like the name of the ship that came to Britain in 1948 and docked in Essex, Tilbury in Essex. This is the reason why I'm here. And so this is the Britain that I grew up in. It's, you know, this is, was very common to just sort of see graffiti around Britain, you know, wogs out, go back on a banana boat, all of this stuff. But I just want to, I wrote something not that long ago, and I'll just read what I said. So talking about race, inequality, visibility, representation, and Blackness in Britain, it's a discussion I have been having my entire life. I just can't remember a point of where it started. It's just been my entire life. And I can recall countless stories that I overheard as a child with my sisters, with my, you know, as I said, my Windrush generation parents, discussing stories with my aunts, uncles, etc., about the blatant everyday racism and unfairness they would face. And of course, later I encountered that same racism and unfairness with my school years spanning the 1970s into the mid-1980s. And a tragic consequence of my childhood being in 1970s Britain was that my sisters and I would play a game called Let's Be White Girls to escape from our realities. So that's just a bit of information. And so I've spent the last 10 years as an artist making work about my story, the Black British story, current ones and forgotten ones as well. Because really I feel as an artist, a visual artist, that I have a sense of duty to kind of contribute to the ongoing process of readdressing persistent absence within the historical record, and to shift the collective narrative that we hold about Black presence in Britain, and to just continue this national debate around Black subjectivity. This is a film, as it says, I made last year, where I filmed actually at Tilbury Docks, as I mentioned, is where Windrush came in. And I platformed stories from members of the Essex Black community. Essex is not far from London. We're on the kind of periphery, so we're, you know, outside of London, and Black voices in Essex are not really. Essex has this stigma and stereotype around Essex women being probably similar to the Jersey girl, I would say, in New York. An Essex girl is kind of seen as being materialistic and sexually promiscuous and devoid of taste. This is what the dictionary has said. giving meaning and weight to what an Essex girl is. And so I've been making work, as I've been living in Essex since 1999, around this kind of double, which was a stigma for me, being moving from London to Essex and really being ashamed to tell Black folks in London that I lived in Essex, this kind of very white area, and with a history of a lot of racism in South End, where I particularly live. Also, as I say, forgotten stories as well, making work and taking care about just presenting, as I say, my history, Black British history. And so this is working with a historian, going into the archives and finding two stories of two Black women that passed through Essex, and just retelling that through a kind of contemporary lens as well, and just just putting it out there really. I'm just looking at the time as well, because I don't want to go over, because we're coming to the end. Also, again, making kind of work about calling out offensive commentary. An English journalist called Rod Liddell said that made a comment in his blog. He writes for the Sunday Times, so he's kind of respected, but he decided that he would write this blog and say that all of the gun crime, all of the crime of sexual violence, basically all of the crap that happens in London is carried out by the African Caribbean community. And what has this community given Britain in return? Goat curry and rap music. That's all we've contributed to the country. So this is a work that was made in response to that statement, that has blaring kind of British rap music in the background. And I made some curry goat. We don't say goat curry, but made some and eat it. It's 8 minutes of me eating the curry goat on screen. And so that's just some examples of work that I've done in the last 10 years. But since, for me, the shift since the wake of the murder of George Floyd and the global Black Lives Matter protests, particularly from white communities around the world for racial justice and inequality, that shift for me has made me, I've been really reflective about, what I do as an artist, what I make, what I put out there. And this shift has made me think about, it's time for a movement towards radical self-care and Black love, because, talking about and addressing and talking about, inequality and racism and what's happened recently is emotional. It's heavy on my shoulders, and I think many Black people around the world right now, we're tired. We've been talking this all of our lives, and trying to fight this, and so it feels as though real care would be for white communities in Britain and around the world to do their homework and let Black people actually just take some time to have some care for themselves, because it's traumatic work. I'm going to finish off with a film that I made last year, which was, I didn't center myself, which I usually kind of center myself in the work. I decided to be behind the lens.
Elsa, that's it now, I'm afraid.
It is. All right, I have gone on. That
11 minutes. Sorry to say.
That's all right. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Okay. Well, as you can tell, far too short for everyone for such excellent work. So we've only got how long now? Yeah, it was going to be 15 minutes. We've only got 12 minutes now for the rest of the panel. And but I'm going to ask questions. Basically, Audre Lorde said it best: caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. And I found that, and that's got quite popular as a kind of statement that people have discussed through kind of radical networks and also in some mainstream channels. And I think it's important to remember that this is kind of like an intersectional battle against, far as I'm concerned, kind of patriarchal systems of dominance. And so I'm going to start with a general question, first of all, to all of the artists. And I can say, in respect of each of your practices involving caring as an act of resistance, how does this influence and change traditional arts practice for you? And is this important? And that can, shall I start with Cassie for that?
How does care?
Yes, so how does caring as an act of resistance influence and change traditional art practice for you? And is this important? So in other words, I suppose I'm saying all the different practices that we've listened to today on this panel are reaching beyond, I would say, traditional art practice. And so the question is how important is that? And what does that mean to you today? And, you know, and do we need more of it? And what does that look like?
I mean, I think for me, and after witnessing both the other two presentations, I see that we are using art institutions and the art world as a place to think and to work and to strategize so that we can support what needs to happen outside of the art world. I think for the hologram and for my work generally, I think that I do my best to kind of take what I can get and incubate ideas within art so that they can leave. Because I think that, like, you know, if I'm really interested in transformation for all people that feel desperate and pushed to the outskirts of society, which I think is most people in different ways. But I think, yeah, I guess that's my answer, to keep it short.
Okay, Tomislav?
Two brief thoughts. I have background in theater, and I think when asked if theater can change the world, I say no, theater cannot change the world, but it can change the existing world under different conditions. And I think in many ways, the practices that we are looking at, they're not necessarily, they're rarely artistic practices, mostly, if so, then speculative. But they are changing the conditions under which we can survive in the presently existing world. And then the second point would be more toward how these practices relate to the world of art and the world of art institutions. We think that at least the practices that we are following, documenting, working with, they are frequently breaking the law. And they are openly breaking the law. And I think that what institutions need to do in order to contest larger problems where these practices are intervening is to be complicit, to have their skin in the game in this transformational world. And they oftentimes do have that license of the art world to accommodate that and to, go as far as they can.
Okay, so Elsa.
Yeah, I think it's almost to continue on from where I was. I mean, in terms of, you know, if I think about care as resistance, I kind of see my practice, or shall I say that my work, I always consider my work around an aesthetic. I present my work within a frame that always considers an aesthetic as an artist. But it's addressing actually issues, you know, political issues, racism, etc., I mean, somebody said to me, just thinking off again, somebody said to me, talking about the first film that I showed, you know, why didn't you present some statistics and so on in your work? And I'm like, well, I'm not a documentary maker. And I'll leave that work. There are, you know, that to documentary makers, somebody writing a book. I'm presenting the care I see, the resistance is actually presenting it through through an aesthetic. I don't know if that's kind of answers the question in any way.
Well, I think what it says is that you're exploring it with your own kinds of creative voice, you know. So that's, you're not, and it's but I've got so many questions I want to ask myself, but that means I'll be ignoring the audience, which would be wrong, which is frustrating for me, but good for them. So I'm going to go to the someone who's anonymous, although I've got other names here. So if you can answer quickly, any of you can just jump in. It says, where is the meta governance taking place? This was asked during Cassie's panel discussion. So you can, Cassie can start this, but if anyone wants to come in afterwards, they're welcome to. So meta governance is like like understand practice of self-regulation. Meta governance, and it's played on kind of increasing role in the last few decades. So Cassie, do you want to, where is the meta governance taking place?
The project is very much about distributed responsibility, and it's meant to be a decentralized network. And the people, a lot of the people that are practicing the hologram come from, we teach courses to kind of set people up psychologically and sort of politically to do this work, which is not valued or practiced in our society. And then after we finish a course, or when people start to get involved making their own hologram, they can enter a kind of community of practice, which is like a general, like regular meeting of people that are doing this, so that there's a feeling of kind of solidarity, but there's also ways to kind of feed back about experience and change the model as it grows. But it's distributed, and eventually, you know, right now it's incubating within an art practice, but eventually it will live on as a practice on its own and be, you know, move and change with the people who use it.
And I think Tom has probably got an answer to this as well.
The practices that we are looking at somewhat heterogeneous. No, it's very different housing struggles that are obviously contesting housing regulation and sort of have to deal with policy, finance, et cetera, as opposed to insurrectionist communities doing reduction of harm and psychosocial support. So these communities have very different modes of self-organizing and self-regulation, though there is kind of the general orientation towards organizing as self-contained and trying to build and expand by collaborating with other such similar self-organizing initiatives in order not to be dependent or not to be even vulnerable to the oppressive state apparatus, no, which always necessarily comes in. No?
Okay, so this is for anyone again. This one, which is thanks for the provocative talks. From someone called Hang, reimagine collective healing. So, how to reimagine collective healing based on the idea of care you have each proposed. That's a very big question, isn't it? That's general, overly general. Okay, there's another one by someone else called, what are some of your personal habits, routines to engage in self-care? And I imagine that's in relation to your work, but also how does that extend beyond the practice itself regarding self-care?
I mean, for me, I have to, as I say, my work sometimes physically hurts my shoulders. But as I said earlier, I just feel a sense of duty to tell these stories, past, present, current, etc. But I have to physically, I have to do yoga. I have to physically look after myself and stop, because and I think, as I said, with this shift now, since the wake of George Floyd's death, it's just like I feel as though I can just kind of, oh, okay, I can just stop.
So we've got 20 seconds.
Oh my God.
So I'm going to just say that to everyone. Yeah. 4 seconds. So basically, thanks everyone, and that was really interesting. We wish we had more time, but that's it.
Thank you, Marc.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cassie and Elsa. Ciao, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.